Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Hodge Hill Church. For those of you in the room here, welcome online as well to our fourth Lent talk in our God in the Ruins series. We are delighted and really fortunate to have Dr. Anupama Ranawana with us tonight. She's up in St Andrews at the moment in Scotland, having been fairly recently in Burundi. Annie said she was reacclimatizing to Scottish weather rather than Burundi weather. But it's wonderful to have Anu with us this evening. She's going to be talking a bit about some of the themes of her book, A Liberation for the Earth, Climate, Race and Cross. Just a very brief introduction before I hand over to Anu. The world is ending. That is something that we've been saying throughout these Lent talks so far. But it means very different things depending on who you are and where you live. For some, the world is ending means the crumbling of familiar, dependable structures and institutions. For a white middle-class heterosexual man in the global north, privileged by those structures and institutions, it could be profoundly unsettling. And people like me, we have seen responding with anxiety, defensiveness, rage even, embodied par excellence perhaps in someone like Donald Trump and many of his supporters. But the world is ending can mean something very different if your island in the global south is literally being submerged by the rising sea because of the indifference of the world's richest nations. For someone in that context, fear, grief, and rage can be very different. In our journey in pursuing racial justice here in Hodge Hill, we've been reading together Azariah France Williams's book Ghost Ship. And in one session, as we read through it chapter by chapter, someone said something like, I don't feel like I'm allowed to be angry in church. I feel like I'm supposed to leave my anger at the door. And so for us locally, we've been on a bit of a journey to explore what it might look like to be in a church where anger and other deep and risky emotions is okay, embraced, encouraged even. And reading Anu's book and rereading it again over the last few days, one of the themes that particularly struck me was of those different kind of responses to a dying world. One possibility that we've touched on before is grief. But grief for a dying world can often be quite a privileged response and can often be paralyzing as a response. Another, which Anna is going to explore with us tonight, another different kind of response is rage. And rage, as I think we're going to discover, can be generative of solidarities, can energize action for justice. So I'm delighted to hand over to Anu, who's going to guide us through some of our thinking and exploring tonight.
Thank you so much, Al, and also Sarah. I'm delighted to be here and talking with you all. I was saying before that I'm always very grateful and shocked when someone has read this little book, which is something that I wrote and thought about in different spaces and in different times, and it comes out of my work trying to be a theologian, but also working globally in different spaces, particularly an experience of trying to talk about Laudato Si, Pope Francis's environmental encyclical, in both the global north and in the global south, and the sort of the different conversations that came out of it. I'll try to, hopefully I'll be coherent. I apologize. I've had to be thinking in French last week, so I'm not sure my English has come back to me. Not that it's very good anyway. I'll try to talk primarily about some of the thoughts that are in the final chapter of the book. So if you've read it, I'm sorry if it's something you've already read or heard or found before. And I'll also try to do a little bit of sort of contemporary analysis and link to some of the Southern theologies that have been very inspirational for me, that I grew up in. I grew up in a Buddhist and a Catholic household. My paternal grandparents were Buddhist Marxists, and my Catholic grandparents were of that kind of 1960s Catholic social justice tradition. So I've always had a bit of a fire in my belly as far as my spirituality is concerned, and it's difficult for me to take that away from my theological work. So I'll begin. So the climate crisis is a racial crisis, a gendered crisis, an economic crisis, a cultural crisis, and a crisis of colonial legacies. We might look at this present time and conclude that there is a need to liberate society from a host of imperialisms. And if I were to do what, Leonardo Boff is doing on the screen in front of you now, as well as Marian Katopo. Boff is a Latin American liberation theologian. Marian Katopo is an Indonesian liberation theologian. If I do the analysis that they did of their present times, I would say that the host of imperialisms I would list would be militarization, nationalism, authoritarian liberalism, ecocide, neocolonialism, and the evil of capital. These are structural logics that continue the logics of imperialism and coloniality that have long troubled theologians, writers, and activists working from and within anti-imperial spaces, especially in what we now call the Global South. And a lot of them, in doing their analysis, they would often say that we need to have a spirituality that's committed to shifting these imperial forces, and that this shifting requires a dynamic struggle. But they would also say that the first step is the analysis of material reality, the seeing, as you would say, or the understanding of a material reality. So I tried to think in the book, because it was written about a couple of years ago now, I look at particular situations. I look at Tanzania, I look at Indonesia, I look at Sri Lanka. But when I was trying to prepare for the talk today, I thought I should think of a more contemporary or a present struggle that is still a long-term struggle. There's always histories are with us. And right in front of our eyes, live streamed in front of our eyes, of course, we have the massacre in Gaza, which in itself is not only a massacre of sentient beings, but is also a massacre of the earth as it is. Another multiple crisis that's in front of us is what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this one is, I think, quite complicated, not only for its own history, but it's also the particular present that it's a part of. Apologies, my screen is a little... in Congo, a key resource that is found in the Democratic Republic of Congo is cobalt, and cobalt is a key component in lithium-ion rechargeable batteries. And as we move towards a greener world, shall we say, there's a growing demand for the extraction of cobalt. So even when we think we're maybe doing better by moving to electric vehicles and things like that, are we actually doing something that's good for the earth? That's the question. More than half of the world's total supply of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The creuseurs in the DSE mine, they mine by hand using the most basic tools to dig out rocks from tunnels deep underground. And many of these artisanal miners include children as young as 7. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, as well as several researchers, and also, I should say, lots of documentation and the conversations coming from the workers themselves talk about the terrible conditions in which they work. They receive poor wages, they may be sexually abused, they suffer injuries, and they risk death. and the expansion of multinational mining corporations to ensure the global supply of cobalt, even, as I said, part of the move to greener vehicles, has led to communities being forced from their homes and farmland. Right now, as we speak, a war rages in the Congo, with many armed groups and national armies fighting each other. And a lot of these armed groups are supported by the global organizations that covet Congo's vast natural resources, particularly, as I said, cobalt. And in the book, I also talk about how we see very similar issues of mercenary groups funded by multinational corporations and governments in countries like Tanzania and in continents like Latin America because of this struggle for natural resources. This is a present crisis, but it's also a crisis that has a history as well. And so we can see here how histories and presence are so closely intertwined. In the 1800s, King Leopold of Belgium realized how resourceful the Congolese rainforests were. And he claimed the country as his private property and forced Congolese men to harvest rubber. He murdered tribal leaders, he destroyed society, he denied people education. And as the Industrial Revolution booms in Europe and the US, Congolese mines were in heavy demand and workers endured appalling conditions. See how the present and the past link together. During the First World War, Congolese minerals were used to fuel explosives. They are still being used to fuel many of the explosives raining down on Gaza. Additionally, the uranium used in the atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima during the Second World War was from the DRC. So you can see here also the interlinkages of militarization, ecocide, and also the disposability of lives throughout the world. And it's important here that we're not only talking about what European leaders did, but also understanding how local elite who succeeded the Europeans after independence wars continued on these legacies, right? So a very key part of a lot of this analysis is to understand that it's that when we speak about anti-imperialism, we are talking about the logics, the oppressive logics that continue it on, and it doesn't matter who's really in charge. So here there's Mobutu, who bled the country over hundreds of millions of dollars, while the West turned a blind eye because they also wanted the right resources. And here really is this is really turning more towards the Cold War, and there again is that the ideological battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, and countries like the DRC then become trapped in the middle of that. So what I was trying to do here in terms of this particular example is just to talk about that present situation and how it's linked to the past. And it's very much a kind of analysis that a liberation theologian would do. And as I was trying to understand, what's going on, and thinking what do we do? And in searching for what must be done, I turned to the movements that are resisting and responding, and the movements that I had known for a long time. Since the 1960s, and now in their conjoining to ecological justice movements, these Southern theologians and activists are part of a long history of religious voices pointing out a need for a moral conversion, a radical break from unfettered growth, which they mark out over and over again as mammon, as what is evil, seeing mammon as a representative of an imperialism that must be destroyed. As Milinda Banerjee has noted, such political theology is part of the diverse cast of characters that come together to aspire for a radical break. And they asked for this during independence struggles, as well as in the continuation of anti-colonial and anti-imperial thinking. It's best expressed in the words of the Indian philosopher Amalados, who notes that there were theologies then and now, and they were created in the sight of struggle, in rage that develops in struggle and is connected to people's everyday lives. He says, the theology of struggle is not about struggle, but often in struggle. It is the reflection of the people who are actually struggling and those who have chosen to struggle with them. A nun I once worked with, and I've known some extremely very cool and radical nuns, remarked once that these theologians were trying to tell a different story, a world imagined from the South. Theology in the global South is always on the front lines of struggle. It has to be, because that is where it is. And it's developed and articulated in these moments of struggle. this kind of political theology is often referred to as theology that originates and then culminates in the political option. It's a biblically inspired response to conflict or social need, and it's also a socially inspired response to the Bible. There's an understanding of the deep-rooted sinfulness of capitalism and plunder, and it's underscored in these theologies in Asia and in Africa, particularly where they have allied themselves to liberational thinking. And it's important to understand that this kind of political theology not only emerged from the struggles for political independence, but also emerged from critiques of colonialism and then the forms of development that came after. Since the 1950s, and more formally in the 1970s with the publication of Gustavo Gutierrez's work in liberation theology, Southern theologians have decried the theological hegemony of Europe and North America and reclaimed the right to speak about God. So this idea of the third world is not supposed to be a kind of pejorative, but it's very much about thinking that there could be a third something, an alternative world that could spring up from the decolonized nations of the 50s and the 60s. It's something, they wanted something between the capitalist and the communist systems. And the Christians of the Third World who latched on to this political consciousness rejected the development model of the 60s and saw it as a kind of a death-creating structure. They rejected European forms of knowledge-making in both, including Western theology and Western church institutions, in both economic and political logic. And their final driver was to work towards a greater ecumenism and interreligiosity, and kind of drawing attention to themselves. They wanted to very much talk about the fact that their dialogue with these different movements was not only about undertaking socialist models, but about building coalition of all religions together who would explore and share their liberative elements and work together to overthrow oppressive systems. And they understand that this liberation context requires constant mobilization against the forces of oppression and exploitation, particularly those that trample down the weak, the poor, and the oppressed people. They're key to think about cultural and material realities, and they want to underscore the importance of taking on a posture of question, investigation, encounter, and mobilization, elements that we do see in the present in the ecological justice movements in the global South. And these are the elements of this struggle are very much also informed by the lived experience. For African and Asian liberation theologians, the fundamental starting point is the lived experience. And in particular, now when we look at some of the conversations now, they look at monopoly capitalism, landlordism, and imperialism, and see that represented by multinational corporations, and are insistent that these oppressions are occurring because of foreign aid, loans, imported technology, and military alliances. As such, I suppose you can see the kind of the emotion and the anger that's part of this analysis, this kind of rage, the important kind of resistive moment here. That's resistive in a generative way because it's also refusing something, and it stems from a liberative praxis that is rooted in not just despair, but as I say, in rage for what is happening to the world. I think what's important here to talk about why it's rage and not grief is because, as Al mentioned in his initial thoughts, is that grief can be a paralyzing action, but more than that, grief can also be quite individualistic, quite inward looking, and saying, oh, something's happening, I'm losing the way of living, and it perhaps stops us from moving forward. So grief can be an action, and is a very valid action, but I think when you look at the theologians I've been talking about in the past and in the present, they would say that grief is not necessarily a transformative form of an emotion. And it's not that it's not that rage is something that's difficult for us as Christians to think about. There are, of course, many scriptural sources for righteous anger, not least Christ's many thunderings to his followers. Christ's righteous anger is one that's grieved by sin, as we see in Mark 3:5, Matthew 21:12, Mark 3:1-6, and several other instances. Anger continues as a theme of the good news of Christ. Such anger is important because it seeks to critique and reform, and also because it stands with those who are most oppressed. I pick up the concept of rage because it is the overwhelming emotion I notice when I have conversations with activists, defenders, religious communities, and scholars in the global south. As other theologians have argued, we must be aware of the different emotions of anger present within these oppressed communities. This is not only because it recognizes and centers their agency as leaders in social movements, but also because such anger provides deep insight, thus informing our theologies of the importance of justice. To pull from a central tenet of liberation theology, justice is different and varied across communities, and there is a need to embrace this multidimensionality. It's important to understand that this prophetic rage is very much a part of the anti-colonial or anti-imperial resistance, and it has long been interwoven with environmental protection. And we can see that there's a generative rage that binds these struggles together, what I call in the book a kind of rainbow coalition. It is the overwhelming epistemic or knowledge-focused emotion that runs through liberation theology, especially the liberation theologies of the Third World, as they argue for breaks from their Western counterparts and raise up the problem of justice. And I wonder if maybe we don't realize that rage is there because it's often easier to recognize these voices only when they are good, when they present themselves gently and in silent gratefulness, negating their actual experience of anger. And so perhaps because of this, we may not always read liberative theologies and see the rage that drives them. However, when we do read more closely to the text, theologians like Samuel, for example, argue that anger is an essential feature of liberation theologies, especially those that write from Black and Dalit perspectives. Samuel notes that Dalit theologies are inspired by the cross, as it's a symbol of revolution that asks for a rising up against oppression, and therefore they cannot be genuine without the emotion of anger. Dalit theologians, therefore, are connecting with the Christ who came to set fire to the earth. This is not to say these theologies are not motivated by love or the experience of divine love, being moved by love and having encountered the being that is loving. Are we not moved to anger to see the lack of love that has been expended on the earth? Gutierrez, for example, always remarks that the real question of loving faith is how we are able to speak about God in a world that is suffering. And I always think about James Cone's question is, what do we do when we are confronted with the broken, battered, bruised body of Christ? Surely an answer must lie in prophetic rage. In the book, I talk about a quote from Pope Francis, who exhorts us to feel outrage as Moses did, as Christ did, and even as the Creator does in the face of injustice. He also says further on in a document called Querida Amazonia, the incidents of injustice and cruelty that took place in the Amazon region in the last century ought to provoke profound abhorrence, but they should also make us more sensitive to the need to acknowledge current forms of human exploitation, abuse, and killing. Of course, I'm not the first theologian to talk about rage. And I would never claim to. I think theology is always a conversation, a constant dialogue. There is, in fact, a long line of prophetic theological thought that sees anger as important in speaking truth to power. Throughout several Christian traditions, there have been many voices arguing that anger is a virtue. Feminist theologians from both Western and non-Western spaces have challenged the conventional understanding of anger as a deadly sin and highlighted the virtuous aspect of rage. Rosemary Redford Ruther identifies anger alongside pride as a theological virtue that is grace welling up from the ground of the oppressed women who transcend false consciousness and break its chains. Indeed, James Cone once remarked that his first book, Black Theology, Black Power, was written in a moment of rage. He wrote the text shortly after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. And Kohn raises the sense of righteous indignation and turns it into theology that's not only prolific, but productive and mobilizing. Lazard, reading Kohn, argues that if we don't hold space for such anger, we also deny the spiritual encounter of our righteous indignation. For both Lazard and Kohn, a theology of anger helps to discern the next move of the revolution. And this quote is one of my favorites. If the church is to remain faithful to its Lord, it must become prophetic, demanding a radical change in the interlocking structures of this society. And probably this is something I've definitely seen lately when I've looked at Anglican Twitter as well. Sorry. Hill, Hill's work on prophetic rage, it's called A Postcolonial Theology of Rage, continues his argument with full treatment, noting that the ability to resist imperialism and to create spaces of peace and justice requires prophetic rage. Hill's argument is similar to mine in that he sees the prospect of world transformation as a project of resisting empire, and this requires mobilization and solidarity, and such collectivizing can best come from a space of rage. Hill also sees a connection between rage and grief, where the latter is the first step towards the former. To think in and with prophetic rage is also to center the voices of those who've experienced oppression. And C.L. Nash, who is a womanist theologian, I think writes about this beautifully and has a book coming out very soon. Dr. Nash notes the experience of women who encountered the divine even in the midst of slavery, and argues that such prophetic rage transforms the way in which we think and the way in which they were thinking about themselves. Such prophetic rage leads us into community. Wilfrid, thinking from both the Christian and Buddhist traditions, agrees, noting that rage understood prophetically is a way to jolt people out of a sense of apathy or indifference. Certainly, some of my own and other arguments are directed towards the fact that grief can be a way of only looking at one's own anxiety and turning away from the suffering of others. Rage, I argue, channeled prophetically, can challenge such inwardness, as we are then charged with our human responsibility. Our charge as persons of faith to be dismayed at how the beauty in creation has been distorted. As I said before, this idea of a theology of rage is not an innovation I bring to the table, but simply a tradition I wish to build on and to especially extend to the discussions surrounding ecological justice. I use the phrase prophetic anger because what I'm linking to is what is articulated by the activists and communities who are demanding a just world. This is an understanding of an anger that is deep, almost illegible, and therefore it's not your normal everyday anger, but anger that seeks transformation. We can think strategically to use this anger to build an oppositional culture, that is, a social model shaped to symbolize an explicit alternative to the prevailing dominant sociopolitical order. Mario Lugones, calls this a kind of separatist anger, which is experienced differently and which causes one to stand apart and refuse the normative anger that recognizes the need for justice and works towards it. I would argue that we need more theological work, not only from a liberational perspective that considers how to theologize rage, but we also need to see rage that charges the everyday agitations of those living in oppressed and exploited communities. And we must try to enter into this rage as a necessary act of our conversion to ecological justice. Working for justice is exhausting, but it cannot cease. The energy for the work of justice must come from somewhere. And certainly it can come from the kind of prophetic rage described above, because it is rage that sees injustice and cannot bear the desecration of the created world. Grief can be a varying business, but grief and anger woven together is what fuels the movement for justice. Such rage can be used for the productive activity of building resistance and therefore informing a liberating perspective. Rage is not only about the liberation of those who are oppressed, but it's also about bringing about reconciliation between the oppressed and the oppressors. Without this kind of rage, underlining our ecological conversion, we will lose the justice narrative, and we will also be too fatigued to continue our work for justice. So I invite you to rage with me and to rage with the communities of the world. Thank you.
Anna, you've offered us some questions there. Do you want to just talk us through those questions to help
Um,
conversation that
sure.
might follow?
I do have some questions if anyone if small groups wanted to take them back, but I'm also open to just having an open discussion.
That's great. Thank you. What we've done previously is we've broken for a bit of a comfort break and then gone into small groups. Um, I think I'm tempted to suggest that we do that again. I saw on Facebook the other day a black and white, what looks like a lino cut picture with some words on, which are these. If the bombs feel far away, press your ear to the ground. The whole earth cries for justice. Anna, you have reminded us to press our ear to the ground, to hear the cries of the earth itself, but also to hear the cries of those who have lived intimately with the earth for generations, but who the imperialisms of our world have invaded, exploited, dispossessed, and destroyed. You've invited us to hear the cries of the earth and to hear the cries of the oppressed and to not shy away from them and not put our defenses, to not switch into polite diplomatic mode or to clamp down because it makes us uncomfortable. And you've invited us to get in touch with the rage that could be within us too, that could be that uniting force, that could be the energy for building coalitions, for building community, for building solidarity across the world in ways that are radically different to the kinds of solidarities that the empires want us to have. And that feels hugely transformative and hugely challenging. Um, I want to just finish this bit with a quote that I picked up when I was rereading your book at the start of chapter 2 from Korean feminist theologian Chung Hyun Kyung. Is I think in order to really heal the world, we need the wisdom of darkness. This can be the third world, dark people, women, or our shadows. All the things we do not want to confront within ourselves, so we project them onto others and call them terrorists. So I think she says that we need endarkenment for a while, not enlightenment, to heal the world. Endarkenment, not enlightenment. Um, and this feels particularly helpful on our journey through this Lent series because it points us towards what follows in the weeks to come. Next week, we have Marika Rose talking from her book, Theology for the End of the World, where the Enlightenment is one of the key themes that she wants to push at and deconstruct. It points us towards Isabel Hamley coming to talk to us the week after on struggling with God, mental health, and Christian spirituality, and our shadow sides and where they bubble up to the surface for us in ways that are not just individual, but are a response to the kind of world that we live in and the pressures that it pushes onto each of us. And it points us finally to the last of our Lent conversations on Palm Sunday evening between Rachel Mann and Carlton Turner in conversation exploring the darkness of God as a way of leading us into Holy Week and the stories and the events, the emotions and the passion that week returns us to in a way that the cry of Jesus's abandonment on the cross resonates with the cries of the earth and the cries of the exploited and oppressed. So that's what we've got to come still. For this evening, we have developed a tradition over the last few weeks of turning finally to Cole Arthur Riley's book, Black Liturgies, for a prayer to finish us. Um, the prayer for week 3 in Lent is a prayer focused on grief. And I decided, in the light of what Anu shared with us tonight, that that wasn't quite where we needed to end up. But Cole Arthur Riley also has a chapter on rage. So Joy, one of our leaders here in Hodge Hill, is going to come up and read Cole Arthur Riley's confession on rage.
And the prayer is confession, God. We confess that we have demonized anger, confining it to an interior prison instead of granting it time and space to be free, just like any other piece of our selfhood. We have not acted in defense of any other, sorry, we have not acted in defense of those who needed it. We have let fear of how we might perceive keep us from truth telling and that others are worthy of, that we are worthy of. We have ignored anger in our bodies, disguising it whichever mask feels good to us. We have valued comfort and wonder over the dignity of the wounded. Have mercy on us for all that suppression stolen from us. Forgive us our emotional numbness and grant us access to safe rage, collective rage, rage.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Anu. Thank you for those who've joined us online. Thank you for those who are here in the room here. Um, let's go away and rage together. Thank you.